Our third paper for today is by Dr. Scott Marr. He received his PhD in history from Boston University in 2012 and is currently a lecturer there in the Division of Social Sciences in the College of General Studies. His research looks at the practice of religious coexistence in the Saumur, from the wars of religion to the revocation of the Edict of Nantes. His paper today is entitled, "Let Us No Longer Speak Among Us of Huguenot and Papist, Civic Identity and Religious Coexistence in the Career of Philippe du Plessis-Mornay."
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. On May 19th, 1610, the governor of Saumur, Philippe du Plessis-Mornay, stood before an assembly of city officials and townspeople. The mood at the town meeting was somber. The death of Henry IV at the hands of a Catholic radical 9 days earlier had plunged the kingdom into mourning. It also raised fears about the renewal of sectarian violence in France. Although Henry IV had distanced himself after his conversion to Catholicism from many of his former Protestant friends and allies, including du Plessis-Mornay, the king had nonetheless respected the provisions of the Edict of Nantes and been sedulous that peace be kept in the kingdom. It was, therefore, in a climate of uncertainty about the future that du Plessis-Mornay addressed Saumur's inhabitants. He told the assembly, quote, "Let us no longer speak among us of Huguenot and Papist. These words are forbidden by our edicts," end quote. "The animosities of the past keep us divided," he added, "and they must be excised." The governor went on, quote, "I therefore beseech you, gentlemen, to embrace one another, to have but one heart and one soul. We are small, but our city can be of consideration. So let us aspire to be praised for setting for our neighbors this good example, despite the malice of the age, of loyalty to our king, love for our country, and care for ourselves," unquote. At du Plessis-Mornay's urging, the royal officers and townspeople raised their hands and took an oath to treat one another as brothers, renounce all partisanship, and live in obedience to the king and the peace edicts. For his part, the governor of Saumur swore to keep all townspeople under the king's authority, thereby binding himself to an impartial application of the law regardless of religion. And as a corollary to this vow, he also pledged to bring stern and swift justice down on anyone who troubled the public order or conspired with enemies of the state. Appeals to public order appear often in du Plessis-Mornay's addresses and correspondence from the period of his governorship of Saumur. He was well familiar with the violence and confusion that religious divisions could create, having barely escaped the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre at Paris in 1572. After Henry III named him governor of Saumur in 1589, a position he would hold for 32 years, du Plessis-Mornay sought to safeguard the city from the resurgence of religious conflict. Catholic-Protestant coexistence could be achieved, he told inhabitants, through a sense of civic solidarity, a solidarity based on shared values and interests, obedience to royal decrees, and respect for public order. And yet, for all his efforts at promoting peace between members of rival churches, the governor of Saumur remained a committed Calvinist. His faith called him to oppose certain Catholic beliefs and practices, which he did in works of theological controversy. Du Plessis-Mornay denied that his intention in these writings was to sow discord among the people. Instead, he saw himself as shining a light on the ways that Christ's church had been corrupted. This defense did not pull much weight with Catholics, however, and he remained, in their eyes, one of the principal enemies of the Catholic Church. We need then to consider du Plessis-Mornay's stance on coexistence together with his efforts to expose Catholic error. As a way of elucidating du Plessis-Mornay's policy of coexistence, I want to look at two episodes in which he confronted inhabitants at Saumur about the dangers of allowing religious divisions to grow up among them. In both cases, he made an appeal to a common civic identity, an identity that committed townspeople to obedience to the crown, conformity to the terms of the Edict of Nantes, and concern for the welfare of the city. I will then turn to consider two works of theological controversy that he wrote while governor and their implications for Catholic-Huguenot relations. In the seeming contradiction between his ethic of coexistence and his assault on Catholicism, Philippe Duplessis Mornay's career as governor of Saumur exemplifies two of the great concerns of the Reformation era: the search for religious truth and the quest for a lasting order. In May 1613, Duplessis Mornay learned that Catholics in Saumur had invited a Jesuit preacher to come to the city to preach the octave of the Feast of the Holy Sacrament. Duplessis Mornay never disguised his hatred for the Jesuits, whom he suspected of having a hand in Henry IV's assassination, and he was furious that the invitation had been made without his knowledge. He summoned the Catholic aldermen responsible for the invitation to the chateau and scolded them for giving their approval to the project without consulting him. Duplessis Mornay explained that it was forbidden for any member of the Jesuit order to preach or reside in places granted to the Huguenots as a city of refuge, a privilege that the crown had conceded to the French Reformed churches. If Catholic inhabitants needed someone to preach the octave of the holiday, he told the aldermen, there was no shortage of preaching orders in Saumur: Capuchins, Cordeliers, Recollects, and if these were not sufficient, Catholics were free to bring in a preacher from outside the city or request the Bishop of Angers to provide one. Duplessis Mornay reminded the aldermen that it was not normally his habit to interfere with Catholic religious life. On only one other occasion had he complained of Catholic preaching in Saumur, when the Jesuit Father Gontier delivered a series of sermons in the city that, quote, with his violence and his venom threatened to corrupt the spirits that, by the grace of God, I have had the fortune to keep in such good peace under their Majesties' edicts, unquote. As in the past, he would not allow the inhabitants to contravene the peace agreement by bringing in a Jesuit, an innovation that would be detrimental to the king's authority as well as to his own. Duplessis Mornay sent the aldermen away, satisfied that he has made his point clear. 2 days later, however, the city's Catholic royal officers returned to protest the governor's policy. They couched their position in the language of religious liberty. The issue of the Jesuit preacher was a religious matter, and they begged the governor to allow them freedom of religion. The city's Protestants, they pointed out, had an abundance of distinguished scholars and pastors from across Europe who came to Saumur to teach and preach. Catholics were simply asking for the same right to have preachers of their liking. To all of this, Duplessis Mornay restated his position. It was essential to public order that the peace edicts be followed, and therefore the Jesuit preacher could not come to the city. 3 years after the Jesuit episode, the governor of Saumur had occasion to tell Protestant townspeople the same message, that religious differences must not prevail over the interests of public order and the observance of the crown's edicts. In February 1616, Duplessis Mornay called an assembly of Huguenot heads of household in order to respond to, quote, some very vicious talk that has given me much displeasure, unquote. The cause of the governor's displeasure was the rebellion of the Prince of Condé the previous summer and fall. The rebellion saw the prince's army pass dangerously close to Saumur, and Duplessis Mornay scrambling to bolster the city's defenses. Compounding the governor's frustrations was the fact that a number of Huguenot nobles had committed themselves to Condé's cause, and that Huguenot towns in the south of France had taken up arms in support. In Duplessis Mornay's view, these moves reinforced the association that Catholics already made between Protestantism and rebellion. In his speech to Saumur's Protestants, Duplessis Mornay addressed criticism of his actions during the rebellion, in particular his decision to include Catholics in the town watch. The governor defended this innovation by citing the king's orders. Quote, I put it to my critics thus, in an order so absolute, so general and so clear, not addressed to me alone, but to all inhabitants, not in regard to religion, but purely in regard to matters of state, if it was up to me to make this decision, to have this prejudice of persons," unquote. The king's orders, in short, did not give the governor grounds to bar Catholics from the watch. Holding the city against the rebels was an act of service to the king, and all of His Majesty's subjects were called upon to take part. But aside from obeying orders, more practical considerations influenced Duplessis Mornay's decision. He reminded the Protestant families that they were too few in Saumur to stage the watch by themselves, and he had no choice but to include Catholics if the city was to have a proper defense. Furthermore, the governor went on, even if Saumur's Protestants were numerous enough to manage the town watch by themselves and exclude Catholics, doing so would be prejudicial to Huguenots in other cities where Catholics had the upper hand. For a religious minority whose existence depended upon Catholic tolerance, it made little sense to encourage the practice of religious discrimination. Duplessis Mornay also replied to criticism that he should have sided with the Prince of Condé. Protestants in France might have used the rebellion to force a more favorable religious settlement from the crown, or, quote, have had the pleasure of seeing the Papists suffer in their turn, unquote. Although the Prince of Condé had courted Protestant nobles in hopes of gaining their support, Duplessis Mornay said that there was never much prospect that Condé, who was himself Catholic, would have treated the Huguenots any better than the Regency did. But beyond the folly of using a quarrel of the nobility as a platform for enhancing the situation of the Reformed Church in France, Duplessis Mornay stressed the fundamental importance of preserving the regime of the Edict of Nantes. So long as the crown observed the peace edicts and safeguarded their religious liberty, Huguenots had no grounds to take up arms without exposing the church and the gospel to scandal. In his addresses and public ordinances, Duplessis Mornay called on townspeople of both faiths to make common cause to uphold the terms of the Edict of Nantes and defend the public order. Joining with each other in this project would build a foundation for enduring coexistence between the city's Catholic and Huguenot communities. Duplessis Mornay's efforts to promote religious coexistence at Saumur stand in jarring contrast to his efforts to advance the Reformed religion. While governor of Saumur, Duplessis Mornay wrote two major works of theological controversy, a treatise on the Mass in 1598, and a history of the papacy in 1611. In these books, he excoriated the central tenets of Catholic belief and practice. Published at moments of political crisis, his treatise on the Mass appeared just months after the Edict of Nantes, and his treatise on the papacy appeared within a year of Henry IV's assassination. These works enraged Catholic opinion in France. Duplessis Mornay's defense of coexistence must therefore be seen alongside his broadsides against what he styled the Roman religion. Duplessis Mornay's treatise on the Mass was his most ambitious and systematic assault on the central rite of Catholicism, totaling over 1,000 pages of text and citing more than 5,000 passages from the Bible and Church Fathers. The book on the institution, usage, and doctrine of the Holy Sacrament of the Eucharist in the early Church set out to demonstrate that the Catholic Church's doctrine of the Mass was entirely without scriptural foundation and lacked historical basis in the practices of early Christianity. Those who participated in the Catholic Mass did not in any way join themselves, spiritually or corporally, to Christ's body, and the ritual did not renew the bonds of Christian love. The ramifications of Duplessis Mornay's assault on the Mass were social as well as theological. By clinging to a corrupted doctrine, Catholics cut themselves off from the society of Christian believers. Huguenots and Catholics might coexist in the same community in the temporal world, but they could never coexist in the community of Christ. For his part, Duplessis Mornay denied that he wrote the book in order to attack Catholic believers. Rather, he hoped that his work would lead Catholics to the discovery of religious truths by prompting them to examine closely their church's dogma. But in excoriating the central rite of Catholic religious life, the book could do little else but provoke outrage. At just the moment when the Edict of Nantes, an edict that Duplessis-Mornay had labored to get approved, was trying to put an end to religious warfare and create conditions in which Catholics and Huguenots alike could participate in public life, Duplessis-Mornay reminded readers of the wide spiritual gulf separating the two churches. 12 years later, Duplessis-Mornay returned to revealing the hollowness of Catholic doctrine in Le Mystère d'Iniquité. The book asserted to give a history of the papacy, chronicling the exaggeration of claims to spiritual and temporal authority that the Pope purported to possess. Duplessis-Mornay used documents taken from Catholic church history, the writings of church fathers, ecclesiastical histories, the decrees of church councils and previous popes, to lay bare the, quote, alleged total power of the Bishop of Rome, unquote. He set out to refute arguments made by Catholic theologians that the Pope possessed the authority to intrude in the political sphere when the salvation of Christian souls was at stake. In particular, Duplessis-Mornay disputed papal claims to having the power to depose monarchs, whether or not they were Catholic, and release their subjects from the bonds of obedience. Duplessis-Mornay deplored the sway that the Roman pontiff and his nuncios had gained in councils of state, as well as, quote, the tyranny of the consciences of both princes and the people that the Pope held, unquote. The book's political argument tied in with its theological message. Over the centuries, the accumulated weight of corruption, deceit, and error had perverted the Church of Christ until it became the Church of Rome. The Roman Catholic Church was a false church, and the Pope at its head was the Antichrist. Reaction to Le Mystère d'Iniquité was similar to that of his treatise on the Mass. Protestants praised it, and Catholics condemned it. Duplessis-Mornay received a fan letter from no less a personage than James I of England, the author of his own treatise on the powerlessness of the Pope to depose princes or release subjects from their oaths of loyalty. Meanwhile, the Sorbonne issued a decree condemning the book. The papal nuncio called for it to be outlawed. 300 copies were seized in Paris, and the Parliament of Paris prohibited the book's sale in the capital. Among Duplessis-Mornay's own friends, opinions differed on the wisdom of publishing a work that angered Catholics at a time of political instability. The moderate Catholic Jacques-Auguste de Thou complained in a letter to the governor of Saumur that the book's publication was inopportune and only served to invigorate the cause of radical Catholics, quote, which in effect returns us to the time of the barricades, unquote. That his book troubled Catholic spirits does not seem to have bothered Duplessis-Mornay, and he insisted that the book did not contravene the peace edicts. Besides, he asked, why should Protestants refrain from contesting the Pope's power, since the Pope was ceaselessly undermining the authority of rulers across Europe and offering encouragement to regicides? Exposing the Pope as the Antichrist was part of the urgent political mission of rescuing the prerogatives of kings. When viewed alongside his treatises on the Mass and the papacy, Duplessis-Mornay's entreaty to Saumur's inhabitants to put aside the words Papist and Huguenot seems to ring hollow. However, a defense of religious truth fitted with a defense of civic order in his understanding of how coexistence could work. As governor of a confessionally divided town, Duplessis-Mornay's greatest concern was to protect Saumur from radicalization that could ignite hostilities between the faiths. Hence, his resolve to bar the Jesuits, a religious order that he saw as responsible for inciting Catholics to spurn the edicts of peace and turn against their Protestant neighbors. Hence, his censure of Protestant householders who sought to keep Catholics out of the town watch, symbolically erasing their status as inhabitants. Duplessis-Mornay may have been acting on his hatred for the Jesuits when he decided to prohibit the order's preachers from coming to Saumur, just as practical considerations influenced his decision to include Catholics in the town watch. But his decisions were made primarily on principle. On these two occasions, the governor scolded townspeople for letting sectarian emotions outweigh concerns for public order. for letting commitments to their religious group override commitments to the collectivity. But if Duplessis-Mornay urged townspeople to give priority to their duties as citizens and subjects, he never imagined that Saumur would cease to be a city of distinct religious communities living in unequal proximity to divine truth. The Catholic-Protestant religious divide was central to Duplessis-Mornay's worldview, as it was to every person living in France in the early 17th century. For the governor of Saumur, Catholic belief and ritual was shot through with ignorance of Christ's message, and this made it impossible for Catholics to join with Protestants in true Christian fellowship. In asking townspeople to put aside the words Papist and Huguenot, Philippe Duplessis-Mornay did not abandon the fundamental assumption of the Reformation era that the different churches possessed unequal claims to Christ's message. Rather, he was asking the people of Saumur to repudiate the partisanship of the past, the assumption that Catholics and Protestants formed incompatible societies, and embrace a group identity that they all shared. Saumur's governor imagined that the two religious communities could support each other and live in harmony, with one community believing rightly and the other believing wrongly. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.